My wife was dying, and I'd just kissed her goodbye for what I thought was the last time. So somebody want to explain to me why two nurses in the hallway were giggling about it like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. That giggle was about to become the loudest sound in my life. My name's Patrick Wheeler. I'm 44 years old. I run an electrical contracting business out of a warehouse off Fruitridge Road in Sacramento. And up until that afternoon, the worst thing that had ever happened to me was finding out my wife had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I want you to sit with that for a second. The worst thing. Because I had a whole ranking system for tragedy, and losing Denise sat comfortably at the top of it for 3 straight months. Turns out I needed a new ranking system. Turns out I needed a lot of things I didn't have yet. A lawyer, a spine made of something other than grief, and about 6 months of patience I didn't know I was capable of. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me set the scene, because trust me, the scene matters. Before I tell you about the hallway, you should probably know what 11 years of marriage looked like from the inside, because none of what comes later makes sense without it. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every villain in these stories thought they were the smartest person in the room. They were not. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Denise and I met at a hardware supply auction in West Sacramento. Not romantic, I know. But that's the truth. And I've never been a man who dresses up a story just to make it prettier. She was there bidding on restaurant equipment for a catering business she was trying to get off the ground. And I was there bidding on a pallet of conduit fittings for the shop. We ended up in a bidding war over a commercial mixer neither of us actually needed, just to see who'd blink first. She won. Then she bought me a coffee out of guilt, and somewhere around the second cup, guilt turned into something else entirely. We got married in a backyard in Fair Oaks, string lights strung between 2 oak trees, a rented arch covered in fake ivy, because real ivy wouldn't have survived the heat. My mother cried. Jerome gave a best man toast that started funny and ended with him choking up halfway through, which surprised both of us. Denise wore her grandmother's veil and looked, I'm not ashamed to say, like the best thing I'd ever seen. Pamela was there too, barely into her 20s at the time, standing up as a bridesmaid in a dress she complained about for weeks beforehand, and then cried in anyway once the ceremony actually started. I remember thinking, watching the 2 sisters hug it out near the dessert table afterward, that I'd married into a family that actually liked each other. That thought would come back around in a very different light. Years later, standing in a hospice parking lot with that same sister at my side for an entirely different reason. For years it was good. Not perfect. Nobody's marriage is perfect. And anybody who tells you different is selling something. But good. We built the contracting business up together in the early years. Her doing the books while I ran crews, and eventually she went back to managing a small catering outfit part-time, while I grew the shop into something that could support both of us without her needing to work at all, if she chose. She chose to keep working anyway. I liked that about her. Liked that she wasn't the kind of woman who needed a man's paycheck to feel like a whole person. Somewhere in the last couple of years, though, something shifted. I couldn't have told you what, not then. Longer hours at the hospital doing volunteer work, she said, helped her feel connected to something bigger. More weekend trips to visit her sister Pamela that stretched a little longer each time. A kind of distance that crept in so slow, I mistook it for the natural settling of a long marriage instead of what it actually was, a woman quietly building an exit. What I failed to realize then, standing in our kitchen the night she told me about the diagnosis, was that the marriage I thought I was fighting to save had already been over for longer than I understood. She told me on an evening that started like any other, pot roast in the oven, the radio playing low, me half listening to a ball game while I went through invoices at the kitchen table. Patrick, she said, sitting down across from me, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not fall apart, because I need you to be strong for both of us. I remember exactly how my stomach dropped. That particular sentence, the I need you to be strong sentence, has a way of hollowing a man out before the actual bad news even arrives. I went in for some tests a few weeks back, she said. Some stomach pain. Nothing I thought was serious. They found something. On my pancreas. I sat there with an invoice in my hand for $1,100 worth of copper wire, and none of it mattered anymore. How bad? I asked. Stage 4, she said. and her eyes filled up right on cue, and I got up and knelt beside her chair and held her like the whole world was ending. Because as far as I understood it, it was. Looking back at it now, kneeling on that kitchen floor with my arms around a lie, I was about to spend 3 months mourning a woman who was never actually leaving me the way I thought she was. Sutter Memorial's oncology wing smells like hand sanitizer and quiet desperation. I'd been there so many times in the last 3 months that I knew which floor tiles were scuffed, which vending machine ate your dollar without giving you the chips, and which nurses would sneak you an extra blanket if you asked nice. Denise had been admitted that morning for what her oncologist, a soft-spoken, expensive watch-wearing man named Dr. Holloway, called a final downturn. Those were his exact words. Final downturn. Like her body was a stock he was tracking. I need you to understand, Holloway told me in the hallway, his voice pitched low and practiced, that we're looking at days now, not weeks. I remember nodding like a bobblehead, because what else do? You can't argue with an oncologist. You can't say no, I don't accept that number. Give me a different number. You just nod, and you go sit next to your wife, and you hold her hand, and you tell her she's been the best thing that ever happened to you. Which I did. You've been the best thing that ever happened to me, I told her, sitting in that stiff vinyl chair that never let you get comfortable no matter how you angled it. Denise squeezed my hand. Her grip was still strong, stronger than I expected from a dying woman, if I'm honest. But grief doesn't let you notice details like that. Grief just wants you to cry and mean it. Patrick, her voice cracked exactly where it should crack. Promise me, you won't fall apart. I'm already apart, I said. I'm in pieces on this floor. She laughed, a wet, broken little laugh, and I laughed too, and we sat there for another 20 minutes, doing what dying people and the people who love them do, which is, pretend the room isn't shrinking. I kissed her forehead. I kissed her hand. I told her I loved her, and I meant every single syllable of it. And then I walked out of that room with my eyes burning and my throat doing that thing where it feels like you swallowed a fist. That would be the last time I ever meant those words to her. I made it about 30 feet down the hallway before I had to stop and lean against the wall. Because that's what grief does. It doesn't care about your dignity. It just drops you wherever it wants. I was standing there, wiping my face with the back of my hand like a kid who skinned his knee, when I heard 2 voices coming from the little alcove by the supply closet. Nurses. I recognized them both. Bridget, a younger one with a nose ring who always called Denise sweetheart, and Rochelle, older, tired-eyed. The kind of nurse who'd clearly seen everything twice. Can't believe she's still going through with it, Bridget was saying, voice low but not low enough. I mean, the man just said goodbye to her like she's actually dying. I froze. My hand was still on my face. I didn't move a muscle. Keep your voice down, Rochelle hissed. You want to get us both fired? I'm just saying. It's messed up. Holloway's in there practically holding her hand under the sheet, and her husband's out here crying real tears. My stomach did something I don't have a word for. Something between falling and turning inside out. It's not our business, Rochelle said. We chart what we're told to chart. We don't ask questions about donor labs and retested biopsies that mysteriously never make it into the official file. I still think somebody should tell that poor man the truth. And lose your license? Be my guest. I got 2 kids and a mortgage. I'm not saying a word. I stood there, frozen. Disbelief crawling up my spine like ice water. I froze in disbelief. Because dying wives don't get retested biopsies that mysteriously never make it into the official file. Dying wives don't have oncologists holding their hand under the sheet. And dying wives, real dying wives, don't giggle about anything, because there's nothing funny left in a body that's shutting down. I didn't move. I didn't breathe right for almost a full minute. I just stood against that wall and let 2 strangers in scrubs rearrange every single thing I thought I knew about my marriage. I want to tell you I marched back into that room and demanded answers right then and there. I want to tell you I was the kind of man who confronts things head on. No hesitation, no strategy. I wasn't. Not that day. That day, I did the only thing that made sense to a man whose whole world had just cracked down the middle. I walked to my truck in the parking garage, sat behind the wheel, and didn't turn the key for 45 minutes. I just sat there, replaying every detail of the last 3 months like I was watching game film. The chemo appointments Denise insisted on attending alone, because it's easier without you hovering. The overnight monitoring stays that always seemed to happen when Holloway was on shift. The way she'd started talking about the life insurance policy 2 weeks after diagnosis. Asking me, real casual, whether I remembered updating the beneficiary information after we got married, whether the payout structure was still current, whether I trusted her sister Pamela to help manage things if it came to that. I'd thought that was just a dying woman getting her affairs in order. Turns out it was something else entirely. I called my best friend that night. His name's Jerome, and he's been running in vac crew 2 doors down from my shop for going on 15 years. Jerome's the kind of guy who tells you the truth even when the truth tastes like a mouthful of gravel. "She's what?" Jerome said, when I got to the part about the biopsy. "I don't know yet. That's the problem. I don't know anything." "Patrick, slow down. You're telling me you think Denise is faking cancer. I'm telling you 2 nurses were whispering about a retested biopsy that never made it into her chart, and her oncologist's got his hand under her sheet." Jerome went quiet for a second. "Then, that's either the worst misunderstanding of your life, or your wife just orchestrated the meanest con I've ever heard of. Thanks, real comforting." "I'm not trying to comfort you, man. I'm trying to help you think straight. You want comfort, go pray. You want answers, you're gonna need proof." He was right. Grief wanted me to fall apart. But something colder, something I didn't recognize yet, wanted proof. Section 1. The investigator the next morning. I did something I'm not proud of. Except I am. Actually, I'm plenty proud of it now. I called an old client of mine, a woman who ran a licensing office out near Watt Avenue, whose panel upgrade I'd wired the year before, and mentioned, offhand, that her cousin did private investigation work out of Elk Grove. His name was Benson. Ex-cop, mid-50s. The kind of guy who talks slow and charges by the hour, and doesn't blink when you tell him your dying wife might be lying to you. Benson's office sat above a laundromat in Elk Grove, one of those spaces that looked like it had been furnished entirely from estate sales. A sagging leather chair, a filing cabinet with a drawer that didn't close all the way, a framed commendation from his old department hanging slightly crooked on the wall. "Walk me through it again," Benson said, leaning back in his chair. "From the beginning. Don't skip anything, even the stuff that feels stupid to say out loud." So I told him. The insurance conversation 2 weeks after diagnosis. The overnight stays that lined up suspiciously well with Holloway's shifts. The hallway whisper about the biopsy that never made it into her file. Benson listened without writing anything down, which surprised me until he explained. "I remember better than I write. Writing's for the report I give you after, once I know what's actually worth putting on paper." "So what do you think? Am I losing my mind?" "I think," Benson said slowly, "that grieving men imagine all kinds of things. Ghosts in every shadow. But grieving men don't usually imagine specific requisition numbers and specific parking garage timelines. Those details are either completely accurate, or you've got a memory for detail most people would kill for." "Give me a week," Benson said, after I laid it all out in his cramped little office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. "I'll tell you if there's smoke, or if you're just a grieving man seeing ghosts." "And if there's smoke?" Benson looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Then I'll tell you where the fire's coming from." As it turned out, that week was going to be the longest 7 days of my entire life. I kept going to the hospital. That's the part that still messes with my head a little. I kept sitting in that stiff chair, kept holding her hand, kept saying I love you in a voice that sounded exactly the same as it had for 11 years of marriage. "You seem distracted," Denise said to me on the 4th day, her voice thin and papery in that way she'd perfected. "Is something wrong?" "Just work stuff," I said. "Clients giving me a headache over a panel upgrade." She smiled and squeezed my hand. "You work too hard." I smiled back. Somebody's got to pay the bills. The thing about lying to someone who's lying to you is that it feels almost peaceful, like 2 actors finally landing on the same rhythm. Dr. Holloway came in during that visit, clipboard in hand, and I studied him for the first time. Really studied him. Mid-50s, expensive haircut for a man on a hospital salary. Wedding ring absent from his left hand, though I later learned he had one at home in a drawer. He talked to Denise the way you talk to somebody you were trying not to smile at in public. "How's our girl doing today?" he asked, and something about the word "are" sat wrong in my chest like a swallowed stone. Tired, Denise said. But hanging in there. That's what I like to hear. He glanced at me, professional as anything. Mr. Wheeler, she's a fighter. She sure is, I said, and I meant it in a way he had no idea about. Benson called twice before the 6th day, just to check in, and both times he told me the same thing. Patience. This kind of thing takes time to surface right, he said. You dig too fast, you spook the wrong person, and then everything goes quiet, and you never get your answer. I'm not built for patient, I told him. I've spent my whole career fixing things the same day somebody calls me. Sitting on my hands while my own life falls apart doesn't come naturally. Everybody says that, Benson said. Then everybody waits anyway. Because what choice do they have? He wasn't wrong. I went to work. I ran my crews. I stood in front of clients discussing panel capacity and grounding codes with a straight face while, underneath all of it, a second version of me was quietly coming undone. Jerome noticed. He always notices. You're somewhere else, he told me one afternoon, watching me stare at a breaker box like it might confess something. I'm exactly where I am, I said. No, you're not. You're standing here, but your head's back in that hospital hallway. I didn't answer, because he was right, and there wasn't a version of that conversation where lying to Jerome accomplished anything. Benson called me on the 6th day. I remember because I was standing in my warehouse, staring at a spool of Romex wire like it owed me money, when my phone buzzed. You sitting down? Benson asked. I'm standing next to a table saw. Close enough. Your wife's biopsy from 6 weeks back came back inconclusive, borderline benign, according to a lab tech I talked to who owed me a favor. Somebody reordered a second biopsy under a different requisition number. That second one never got filed under her name in the hospital system. It got filed under a code that traces back to a private lab Holloway uses for personal referrals. My mouth went dry. Meaning what? Meaning your wife doesn't have stage 4 anything, Mr. Wheeler. Meaning somebody built a paper trail to make it look like she does. I had to put my hand against the workbench to keep myself upright. There's more, Benson said. There's always more. Your life insurance policy. The one through Pacific Sun Mutual. Somebody submitted a beneficiary change request 3 months ago, right around when she got diagnosed. Moved the primary payout structure so that in the event of her passing, 40% routes through a secondary trust before it ever touches your joint accounts. A trust I don't know about. A trust administered, Benson said, by her sister, Pamela. From that moment on, Pamela was about to become a very important character in this story. I want to explain something about grief and about betrayal, because people always assume they cancel each other out, like once you find out you've been lied to, the sadness just evaporates and all that's left is rage. That's not how it works. Not for me anyway. I still loved her. That's the ugly, embarrassing truth I sat with for 2 straight nights, staring at the ceiling of our guest room because I couldn't stand to sleep next to her anymore, faking my own exhaustion so she wouldn't ask questions. I loved a version of Denise that I now understood had never fully existed, or maybe had existed once, a long time ago, before whatever calculation she'd run landed on insurance fraud with my oncologist as the answer. But love doesn't get a vote when somebody's trying to steal your life out from under you while you weep at their bedside. I called Jerome back. I called Benson. And on the advice of my old client turned unofficial consultant, I made an appointment with an actual attorney. A sharp, no-nonsense woman who worked out of a small firm downtown, the kind of lawyer who'd clearly heard worse than my story before breakfast. Here's your situation, my attorney told me, flipping through the documents Benson had gathered. If your wife fakes her death, or even if she doesn't, and just lets this play out to some miraculous late-stage remission after the money's moved, you're the one holding an insurance policy that's already been restructured without your consent. That's fraud, Miss Wheeler. And depending on how deep this goes, it could be conspiracy. So what do I do? She looked at me the way Benson had looked at me in his office, like she respected that I hadn't fallen apart yet, and like she suspected I might, eventually, and wanted to get ahead of it. You do exactly what they're doing, she said. You build your own paper trail, quietly, and you make sure that when this unravels, and it will unravel, Mr. Wheeler, people like this always overreach, You're the one standing on solid ground and they're the ones standing on nothing. From that moment forward, standing on nothing was about to become the theme of the rest of this story. Jerome, of course, had opinions about all of this, because Jerome always has opinions, and he's never been shy about sharing them whether or not I've asked. You know what the crazy part is? He said the two of us sitting on the tailgate of my truck outside the shop one evening, sharing a six-pack that neither of us was really tasting. You've spent 3 months being the most devoted husband I've ever seen. Grief support groups should be studying you. Feels great in hindsight, I said. I'm just saying. You cried at that woman's bedside like it was a Sunday church service, and the whole time she's got her oncologist measuring drapes for a house in Bend. You're not helping. I'm not trying to help. I'm trying to make sure you don't lose the thread here, because I know you, Patrick. I know you're going to start feeling guilty about being angry, and you cannot afford that right now. Not with what she's doing to you. He wasn't wrong. That's the maddening thing about a friend who's known you since high school. They see the exact shape of your weaknesses because they helped build half of them. I'm not going to feel guilty, I said. You're already feeling guilty. I can see it on your face right now. I didn't answer that, because he was right, and there wasn't a version of that conversation where lying to Jerome twice in 1 week accomplished anything either. Look, Jerome said, softer now, setting his beer down on the tailgate. You didn't do anything wrong here. You loved your wife. That's not a character flaw, man. The character flaw belongs entirely to her, and to that doctor with the watch that costs more than my truck. It probably does cost more than your truck. Don't change the subject. I laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in weeks, and something in my chest loosened just slightly. Not healed, not even close, but loosened enough to keep breathing through the next stretch of this. Section 1. Flipping the script, here's what we did, and I say we because by that point it wasn't just me anymore. It was me, Jerome, Benson, my attorney, and eventually Pamela's own conscience, which turned out to be a more useful weapon than any lawyer. First, I quietly opened a separate account and began redirecting a portion of my own contracting income there, not hiding money, exactly, just making sure that whatever came next, I wasn't standing at zero. Second, my attorney filed paperwork with Pacific Sun Mutual flagging irregularities in the beneficiary change request, citing my legal right as the policyholder's spouse to be notified of structural changes. This didn't stop anything immediately. Insurance companies move like glaciers, but it put a flag in the system. A quiet, ticking flag. Third, and this is the part I'm proudest of, Benson found Pamela. Pamela, Denise's younger sister, had always struck me as sweet, but a little lost. The kind of person who does what her older sister tells her because it's easier than having her own opinions. She worked as an office manager for a dental practice off Watt Avenue, drove a beat-up Civic, and had co-signed on nothing in her life until apparently this trust. Benson tracked her down at a coffee shop near her office and, with my blessing, told her exactly what he'd found. She near about spilled her coffee, Benson told me afterward. Didn't know the half of what her sister was actually doing. Thought it was some kind of legitimate estate planning. Once I laid out the fake biopsy, the affair with the doctor, she went white as a bedsheet. She didn't know? She knew there was a trust. She didn't know there wasn't a cancer. I sat with that for a long moment. Is she going to help us? She's terrified, Benson said. But yeah, I think she will. Pamela called me 2 nights later. Her voice shook the entire time. Patrick, I swear to you, I didn't know Denise wasn't sick. I thought I was helping set up a trust so the money wouldn't get eaten by taxes if the worst happened. I believe you, I said, and I meant it, mostly because rage needs somewhere to go, and I didn't have room in mind for Denise's little sister. She told me you'd understand. She said you two had talked about it. We never talked about it, Pamela. Silence stretched across the line. There's a house, Pamela finally said, voice barely above a whisper. In Oregon. Bend, I think. Denise and Dr. Holloway they've been planning to relocate there. After the death certificate goes through and the policy pays out. My hand tightened around the phone hard enough that I heard the plastic creak. She's going to fake dying, I said, more to myself than to her. There's a private clinic, Pamela said. One of Holloway's old colleagues runs it. They were going to falsify a death certificate, some kind of arrangement where a real deceased patient's paperwork gets. I don't even understand it fully, Patrick. I swear. I just know there's a date. Sometime in the next few weeks. A final downturn that turns into an actual death, on paper. That phone call was the exact moment the plan flipped from defense to offense. Here's where I had a choice to make, and I want you to understand both options, because I thought about both of them long and hard. Option 1. Blow it up immediately. Walk into that hospital room, throw every piece of evidence Benson had gathered onto her lap, and watch her face while I did it. Option 2. Let it play out. Let her think it was working. Let Holloway believe he'd gotten away with it. And be standing there, evidence in hand, lawyer on speed dial, the exact moment they thought they'd won. Jerome, predictably, wanted option 1. Burn it down now, man, he said, sitting across from me at the diner we always went to off Stockton Boulevard. One that had been slinging bad coffee and good omelets since before either of us could drive. Why let her keep playing you? Because if I confront her now, she'll just adjust the plan, delay it. Maybe not even go through with the fake death, but she'll definitely find some other angle to move that money before I can stop it. If I let it play out, I control the timing. Jerome studied me for a long second, then leaned back in the booth. You've changed, man. Yeah, well, I stirred my coffee I wasn't going to drink. Somebody's gotta. I was about to become a better actor than either Denise or Dr. Holloway. There's a strange skill you develop. Playing a role like that for weeks on end, you start noticing your own performance the way an actual actor might. Cataloging which gestures land, which ones feel forced. Adjusting in real time. I brought her flowers twice a week. Sunflowers, her favorite, from the grocery store on the way to the hospital. I sat through updates from Holloway about declining white counts and concerning scan results that I now understood were entirely fabricated. Numbers plucked out of thin air to match whatever timeline they'd settled on. You've been so strong through this, Denise told me once, brushing my hair back from my forehead the way she used to when we were newly married, and neither of us had anything to hide. I don't know what I'd do without you. You won't have to find out, I said, and let her read that however she wanted. Once, in the hospital cafeteria, I ran into Bridget, the younger nurse with the nose ring, getting coffee near the vending machines. She smiled at me. The same soft, sympathetic smile she probably gave every grieving spouse who wandered through that building. How are you holding up? She asked, and I wondered standing there, whether she had any idea that I now knew exactly what she and Rochelle had been whispering about weeks earlier. Some days are harder than others, I said, which was true in a way she couldn't have understood. She's lucky to have you, Bridget said, and walked off toward the elevator, completely unaware that her hallway conversation had detonated an entire marriage 2 floors below her feet. I stood there for a long moment after she left, coffee going cold in my hand, thinking about how strange it was that the 2 people who'd cracked this whole thing open for me would never even know they'd done it. For the next several weeks, I played my part. I sat at her bedside. I held her hand. I let Dr. Holloway update me on her declining numbers with a straight face, nodding along like a man who believed every word. She's not responding to the latest round, Holloway told me one visit, voice heavy with practiced sorrow. I think we're looking at hospice care very soon. Whatever she needs, I said. Whatever gives her comfort. Behind that mask, I was watching everything. Watching which night's Holloway's car, a silver sedan I'd learned to recognize in the parking garage, stayed parked well past visiting hours. Watching Denise's phone, which she thought she'd hidden well enough, light up with a contact saved simply as pharmacy. A contact Benson traced back to a prepaid number registered to Holloway. My attorney filed the paperwork quietly, methodically, laying legal groundwork that would matter enormously the moment this all came to a head. Documentation proving I'd never consented to the beneficiary restructuring. Documentation proving the biopsy discrepancy, sworn statements from Pamela about the Oregon property and the private clinic arrangement. Pamela, for her part, became an unlikely ally. She fed us updates, the date they were targeting, the paperwork Holloway's colleague was preparing, even a screenshot of a real estate listing in Bend that Denise had saved to her laptop and, in a moment of carelessness, left logged in while borrowing Pamela's charger. They're targeting the date 3 weeks out, Pamela told me, her voice thinner every time we spoke, guilt eating at her from the inside. Holloway's colleague, the hospice physician who runs that facility near Roseville. He's the one signing off on the certificate, Pamela continued. Once that's filed, the claim goes to Pacific Sun Mutual, and once it clears, they disappear to Oregon, I finished. 3 weeks was exactly enough time to build a trap with teeth. There was a night, somewhere in the middle of that stretch, where I almost broke. Denise called me from the hospital, voice thin and shaky in a way that, by then, I understood was performance, but performance built on real skill, the kind you only get from months of practice. "Patrick, I'm scared," she said. "I don't want to die not knowing you forgive me for anything I might have done wrong in this marriage." I sat on the edge of our bed, phone pressed to my ear, and for one long, terrible moment, the old version of me, the one who'd married her under string lights, the one who still automatically reached for her hand in his sleep, nearly answered her the way that man would have. "There's nothing to forgive," I almost said. Instead, I said, "You've never done anything wrong, Denise," and let her hear exactly the tenderness she wanted to hear, while some colder part of me took quiet, careful notes on the exact shape of her performance, filing it away next to everything Benson had already given me. After I hung up, I sat there in the dark for a long time, hating how much of me still wanted to believe her. "You good?" Jerome asked when I called him 20 minutes later, because I couldn't sit with it alone. "No," I admitted. "But I will be." "That's the most honest thing you've said in weeks," Jerome said. "My attorney was the one who came up with the sharpest part of the plan, and I want to give her full credit, because without her legal mind, I'd have just been an angry man with a folder of evidence, and nowhere useful to put it. Insurance fraud requires proof of intent and proof of the false claim being filed," she told me, tapping her pen against a legal pad covered in notes. "Right now we have overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Motive, opportunity, financial restructuring, an affair, and testimony from the sister. But we don't have them in the act. So we wait until they file the claim. We wait until the death certificate is signed and submitted," my attorney said. "That's the moment the fraud becomes actionable, the moment it moves from planning to execution. Before that, it's just a very suspicious, very ugly marriage. And after? After, it's a felony. Multiple felonies, actually. Insurance fraud, falsifying a public health document, conspiracy, Dr. Holloway loses his license the moment this surfaces, regardless of criminal outcome. And your policy stays entirely yours, because a fraudulently obtained payout is void from the start. Which means that trust Pamela's been holding for her sister? Legally worthless the moment we prove intent." I sat back in my chair, letting that settle. "I want to be there," I said, "when it happens. When they realize it's over." My attorney almost smiled. "Almost. I figured you would." The 3 weeks crawled by like they were dragging something heavy. I kept visiting. I kept holding her hand. There was one visit, near the end, where Denise looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something almost like guilt, flickering behind eyes that had gotten very good at looking exhausted. "Patrick," she said, "if something happens to me, I need you to know I've always..." "Don't," I said, gentler than I felt. "Don't do the deathbed speech. Save your energy." She blinked, surprised, maybe even a little hurt. "I just want you to know I love you." I looked at her for a long moment, somewhere behind my ribs, the last honest piece of me, the piece that had married her 11 years ago in a backyard in Fair Oaks with string lights and a rented arch, cracked one final time and went quiet. "I know," I said. "I've always known exactly how much." She smiled, thinking it was tenderness. It wasn't tenderness. Not anymore. Benson tracked the paperwork through a contact at the county recorder's office. Legally, mind you, nothing that would jeopardize the case. Just watching public filing queues the way you'd watch a pot waiting for it to boil. On the day the private hospice physician submitted the preliminary death certificate paperwork, 3 weeks and 2 days after Pamela's tip. An ordinary gray morning that felt too plain for what it was about to set in motion. Benson called me. "It's filed," he said. "Preliminary cause of death, pending final signature. Complications from pancreatic cancer. Signed by the hospice physician, co-signed by Dr. Holloway. She's not even in the building anymore, is she?" transferred to the private hospice facility near Roseville 2 days ago, which means somewhere in the next 48 hours, that final signature gets submitted. The claim goes to Pacific Sun Mutual, and your wife Benson paused. Your wife's supposed to disappear. Not today, she's not, I said. I called my attorney. I called Jerome. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I stopped pretending to be sad. The next 48 hours were going to be the most satisfying of my entire life. The night before we drove out to Roseville, I couldn't sleep, so I sat at the kitchen table going over Benson's file one more time. The way you'd rehearse lines before a performance you couldn't afford to flub. Jerome showed up around midnight, uninvited, carrying a paper bag of takeout neither of us needed. Figured you weren't sleeping, he said, dropping into the chair across from me. You figured right. You nervous? I don't know what I am, I admitted. Angry, sad, a little bit excited, which feels like it should embarrass me more than it does. It shouldn't embarrass you, Jerome said. Unwrapping a burrito like this was any other night. You've been carrying 3 months of somebody else's lie on your back. Man's allowed to feel something other than sad when the weight finally comes off. What if she talks her way out of it? Denise is good at that. Better than good. Then your attorney and Benson and Pamela, and every scrap of paper in that folder does the talking for you instead, Jerome said. You don't have to win an argument with her tomorrow, Patrick. You just have to stand there and let the truth land where it's supposed to land. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. When did you get so wise? I asked. Around the 3rd time you called me crying at some ungodly hour, Jerome said. Not unkindly. A man learns things. We sat there another hour, not talking about the case anymore, just eating bad takeout at my kitchen table like it was any ordinary night. Except it wasn't. And both of us knew it. And neither of us said so out loud. My attorney moved fast once the paperwork hit. She filed an emergency motion with the county citing suspected fraudulent death certification, attaching Benson's documentation, Pamela's sworn statement, and the biopsy discrepancy. That kind of motion doesn't usually move quickly, but a licensed attorney flagging active insurance fraud involving a still-living patient gets attention in a hurry, especially once she looped in an investigator from the state medical board, who apparently had been quietly circling Dr. Holloway for an unrelated licensing complaint for over a year. Small world. Karma's apparently been keeping its own file on this guy longer than I had. We drove out to the private hospice facility near Roseville. Me, Jerome, my attorney, and an investigator from the county, who was handling the fraud complaint. Pamela met us in the parking lot, hands shaking, looking like she hadn't slept in a week. I can't believe I'm doing this, she said. You're doing the right thing, I told her, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I actually meant something kind. We walked into that facility together. Denise was in a private room near the back. No monitors hooked up to her, I noticed immediately. No IV drip, nothing. Just her, sitting up in the bed reading a magazine like she was waiting for a spa appointment instead of her own funeral paperwork. She looked up when I walked in, and for one full second, her face did something I'll never forget. It cycled through surprise, then calculation, then a kind of brittle, practiced sadness, like she was trying to remember which mask fit the scene. Patrick, she said. What are you doing here? You shouldn't see me like this. Like what? I said. Alive? Her face went white. Dr. Holloway walked in behind her a moment later, a clipboard in hand, and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw the 4 of us standing there. Mr. Wheeler. He started. I don't think. Save it, my attorney said, stepping forward with a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. Dr. Holloway. I'm an attorney representing Patrick Wheeler. This gentleman behind me is with the county, investigating a fraudulent death certificate filed under your co-signature this morning. I'd strongly suggest you don't say anything else without your own counsel present. The investigator stepped forward and produced a badge, his voice flat and procedural in a way that somehow made the whole scene feel even more final. Dr. Holloway, we've received a formal complaint alleging that the death certification paperwork you co-signed this morning contains materially false medical information regarding a living patient. I'll need you to come with me so we can sort out the details properly. This is a mistake, Holloway said, but his voice had already lost its bedside polish. It sounded, for the first time since I'd met him, like the voice of an ordinary, frightened man. Then it'll sort itself out. the investigator said. That's what the process is for. Doctor, Holloway tried to find his voice again, sliding back into the practiced calm of a man used to controlling a room. Mr. Wheeler, I understand this looks concerning, but there are medical explanations for. Save the bedside voice, I said. It doesn't work on me anymore. This is insane, Denise said, sitting up straighter, color returning to her face in the form of pure fury. Patrick, what is this? What have you done? What have I done? I said, and something in my voice must have surprised even me, because Jerome shot me a look like he'd never heard me talk like that. I said goodbye to you in that hospital room, Denise. I meant it. I cried real tears walking out of that building, and 2 nurses in the hallway were laughing about it before I even made it to the elevator. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Bridget and Rochelle, I said. The nurses. In case you're wondering how it started. You've been planning this, Denise said slowly, eyes narrowing. This whole time. You've been playing along, I said. Same as you. Difference is, I wasn't the one faking a biopsy. Pamela stepped forward then, and I watched her sister's face crumble in a completely different way. Not fear of getting caught, but something closer to genuine betrayal, the kind that only lands when it's family doing it. Pamela, Denise breathed. You didn't. You lied to me, Pamela said, voice shaking but steady. You told me it was tax planning. You told me you were actually sick, and this was just about protecting the money from probate. You never told me there wasn't a cancer, Denise. You never told me about him. She jerked her chin toward Dr. Holloway, who had gone very quiet, very pale, clearly doing calculations about his career that had nothing to do with oncology. I did this for us, Denise said, turning back to me. And there it was, the pivot, the reframe, the last con of a woman who'd run out of road. For our future. Once the money cleared, I was going to explain everything. I swear, Patrick, I was going to bring you in on it. You were going to fake your own death and vanish to Oregon with your oncologist, I said. There's no version of that story where I'm in on it. There's just a version where I'm a grieving widower standing at a fake grave while you build a new life on money you stole from me. You don't understand what this marriage turned into for me, Denise snapped, some mask finally slipping. Do you have any idea what it's like watching your husband build his whole identity around a truck and a toolbox while your own life just sits there, waiting? So the answer was fraud, I said. Not a conversation. Not a divorce. Fraud. The answer was survival, she said. No, I said. The answer was greed wearing survival's clothes. I'd have given you a divorce, Denise. I'd have given you half of everything. Clean, legal, no hard feelings, if you'd just told me the truth instead of putting me through 3 months of watching you die. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since I'd known her, Denise Wheeler had absolutely nothing to say. The county investigator cleared his throat. Dr. Holloway, I need you to step outside with me. We have some questions about the certification you co-signed this morning, and about a licensing complaint that's been open against you for 14 months. Holloway's face did something between a wince and a full collapse. This is a misunderstanding. Explain it to the medical board, the investigator said. Not to me. Denise tried one more time as they led her through the paperwork of what would become, over the following months, a fraud investigation, a divorce filing, and eventually, after a plea deal that spared her actual prison time but not much else, a felony conviction that ended any dream she had of a quiet new life in Oregon. Patrick, she said, grabbing my sleeve as I turned to leave. You still love me. I know you do. Nobody fakes crying like that. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, then up at her face, the face I'd kissed goodbye, the face I'd told you've been the best thing that ever happened to me, the face that had been laughing behind closed doors with a man in an expensive watch while I sat in a hallway, grieving something that was never real. I didn't fake anything, I said. That's the difference between us. I actually loved you. You just never deserved it. I pulled my arm free and walked out of that room, and this time, when I walked down that hallway, there were no tears on my face at all. Standing in that parking lot with Jerome's hand on my shoulder, I was about to build a better life out of the wreckage of that one. And Denise was about to spend the next several years watching every piece of it happen from the outside. The months following that hospice room blur together in my memory the way a bad fever does, clear in pieces, foggy in between. There were depositions. There were meetings with the state medical board where I had to sit in a waiting room outside a hearing I wasn't allowed into, waiting for Benson to text me updates like I was waiting on a jury. There was a moment, sitting across from a mediator during the divorce proceedings, where Denise's own new attorney, a tired-looking man who clearly hadn't been told the full story when he took the case, tried to argue that our marital assets should still be split evenly, given the emotional toll of a genuine health scare on the marriage. My attorney didn't even raise her voice. She just slid a folder across the table containing Benson's documentation, the falsified requisition number, and Pamela's sworn statement, and said, "There was no health scare. There was a felony in progress. We can litigate that distinction in open court if your client would prefer the publicity." The mediation ended 40 minutes later with terms entirely in my favor. Pacific Sun Mutual voided the policy entirely once the fraud was confirmed, which meant the 40% Denise had tried to route through Pamela's trust evaporated, not into my account, just gone. The way stolen things tend to go when the theft gets exposed before it finishes. I didn't get a windfall. I didn't need one. What I got was worth more. The truth, on record, in a county filing that couldn't be argued with, disputed, or spun into a sob story at some future dinner party. Dr. Holloway lost his medical license within the year, the fraud investigation dovetailing neatly with that older complaint the state medical board had already been sitting on. Something about improperly prescribed medications for a previous patient he'd also, apparently, been sleeping with. Guess that was a pattern with him. He took a plea on the fraud charge, did a short stretch, and last I heard was selling medical equipment, somewhere in Nevada. Which felt like exactly the kind of soft landing a man like that deserves. Small, humiliating, invisible, I heard through Benson, who still keeps half an ear on these things out of professional habit, that Holloway tried briefly to reinvent himself as a wellness consultant once he got out, something involving supplement sales, and a website full of stock photos of mountains. It didn't last. Turns out a felony fraud conviction follows a man around even in an industry with famously loose standards. Last Benson checked, he was working behind a counter, selling hospital beds and walkers to people who genuinely needed them, which struck me as its own strange, quiet justice. A man who once fabricated a dying patient, now spending his days outfitting rooms for people who are actually sick. I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I heard that. Not sympathy. Something closer to a case, finally closing all the way. The last loose thread getting tucked in. Denise pled guilty to insurance fraud and conspiracy, avoided prison through a deal that hinged largely on Pamela's cooperation and testimony, and got 5 years of probation, a felony record, and a divorce that left her with nothing from our marriage but the furniture she'd picked out herself. I made sure of that last part personally. My attorney made sure of the rest. I went to the sentencing hearing, which I hadn't strictly needed to do, but I wanted to see it through to the end with my own eyes. Denise stood at the defense table in a gray blazer that looked like it had been chosen specifically to read as remorseful, and when the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she turned briefly toward the gallery, toward me, like she was hoping for one more performance to land. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said. "I made a terrible decision out of fear, and I take full responsibility." The judge, a woman who looked like she'd heard every possible version of that sentence over a long career, simply nodded and moved on to reading the terms of probation, restitution, and the formal revocation of any claim to the insurance proceeds. There was no dramatic gavel moment, no movie-style come-up-and speech, just paperwork, read aloud in a flat, bureaucratic tone, which somehow felt more satisfying than anything scripted could have. I didn't say a word to her on the way out of the courtroom. I didn't need to. The silence said everything I'd spent months learning how to say. Pamela and I still talk sometimes. Not often. Enough that I know she's doing okay. That she's in therapy. That she's stopped apologizing every time my name comes up in conversation. I told her once that she didn't owe me any more guilt than she'd already paid off, and I meant it. She was a tool in her sister's hands before she became the reason the whole thing came apart. That matters. Jerome still runs his vac crew 2 doors down. He still hits me with the unvarnished truth, no matter how much it stings, and he still orders the same bad omelet at that diner off Stockton Boulevard. And some evenings we sit there and don't talk about any of this at all. which is its own kind of relief. Benson sends me a Christmas card every year, which is a strange thing for a private investigator to do. But I've stopped questioning the ways people show they care. I ran into Pamela once, close to a year after everything settled, at a grocery store off Fair Oaks Boulevard of all places. She looked healthier than I'd seen her in the whole ordeal. Steadier, like a weight had actually come off instead of just shifted position. "I keep thinking I should apologize again," she said, standing there with a shopping basket between us like a small shield. "You don't owe me another one," I told her. "You already paid that debt the day you walked into that facility with me." She nodded, eyes a little wet, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing important. Her new job, my business, the ordinary small talk of two people who'd been through something extraordinary together, and didn't need to relive it every time they crossed paths. Before she left, she said one more thing. "For what it's worth, Patrick, I don't think she ever really understood what she was throwing away. I think she convinced herself you'd be fine, that you'd land on your feet either way." "I did land on my feet," I said, "just not because of anything she planned for me." Pamela almost smiled at that. "No," she agreed, "definitely not because of that." Before she walked off toward the checkout line, she paused one more time. "For what it's worth, I still believe most people aren't built like her. I needed to believe that again, after everything. Otherwise I'd never trust anybody, including myself." "You will," I told her. "Trust rebuilds slower than it breaks." "But it rebuilds." She nodded, gave a small wave, and disappeared down the cereal aisle, back to whatever ordinary evening she had waiting for her. Groceries, a quiet apartment, a life finally rebuilt on her own terms instead of her sister's schemes. As for the nurses, Bridget and Rochelle, I never spoke to them directly, never told them what their hallway whisper had set into motion. I like to imagine they never even connected the dots, that somewhere in that hospital they're still working 12-hour shifts, still whispering about things they shouldn't, completely unaware that one overheard conversation ended a marriage, a medical career, and very nearly an insurance company's 40% payout. I sold the house we'd bought together, bought a smaller one on the other side of Sacramento, closer to the shop, closer to Jerome. Some mornings I still catch myself reaching for a phone that isn't ringing, expecting an update on chemo numbers that were never real to begin with. The business, oddly enough, grew during that stretch. I threw myself into it the way some men throw themselves into the gym after a bad breakup. Not entirely healthy, maybe, but productive. I picked up 2 new crews, took on a commercial contract renovating a strip of offices off Howe Avenue, and for the first time, in over a decade, started thinking about what I actually wanted out of the rest of my life, instead of just what kept the lights on. Jerome still gives me grief about it. "You've turned into a workaholic," he told me once, watching me review a bid at nearly midnight in the shop. "Better than the alternative," I told him. "There's a middle ground, you know, between workaholic and whatever you were during the divorce. I'll find it eventually." "You better," Jerome said, "because the woman who runs the front counter at the parts supply house has been asking about you for 2 months straight, and I'm getting real tired of playing messenger." I laughed at that. Actually laughed. The kind of laugh that surprises you a little because you'd forgotten, your body still knew how. But mostly, I don't. There's a version of this story where I spend the rest of my life bitter, where every relationship after Denise gets filtered through suspicion, where I can't sit in a hospital waiting room without my stomach turning. I won't lie and tell you none of that happened. For a while it did. I flinched at every hallway whisper, for months afterward, half expecting some new betrayal to come crawling out of the woodwork. But somewhere along the way, maybe around the time the business started growing again, maybe around the time Jerome stopped needing to check on me quite so often, maybe around the time I stopped dreading the sight of my own reflection in a dark window, something in me settled back into place. Not the same shape as before, you don't get that back, but a workable shape. A shape I could live inside of without constantly bracing for the next lie. Mostly I think about that hallway, the one outside her hospital room, the one where I stood frozen in disbelief, tears still wet on my face, listening to 2 strangers laugh about a lie I hadn't caught yet. That was the exact moment I stopped being a man who got lied to, and started becoming a man who got even. No forgiveness, no reconciliation, just the truth, finally standing where the lie used to be. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the full story, whether I regret letting it play out as long as I did instead of confronting her the moment I overheard that hallway conversation. I tell them the same thing every time. Confronting her that day would have felt good for about 10 minutes and cost me everything Benson and my attorney and Pamela's courage eventually won back for me. Dollar for dollar and fact for fact. Patience isn't the same thing as forgiveness. Sometimes patience is just revenge, taking its time to load all the way. And honestly, that's a better ending than anything Denise could have written for herself. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.